Welcome, everyone. I'm very excited about what we have to offer you here. This is going to be an unscripted, wide-ranging, I hope very interesting discussion of free speech in America. And we're going to be guided by some values or some principles, which you can start thinking about. Those are equanimity, accountability, and reciprocal liberty. Now, people will have different understandings of those principles because people bring different perspectives and different traditions to bear on the question of free speech. I think that now is a very interesting moment to be thinking about these things because we're at a moment in American history and culture when I think a lot of our traditions are up for grabs, or they're being questioned, or they're being upended. And so my hope is that we can have an interesting discussion of where we are and where we want to go that will be informed by all of our different perspectives. In some sense, this is, I think, sort of like a Quaker meeting because, if you have questions, please feel free to post them in the question and answer, the Q&A box, and we will try to get to those. And also, we will go back and forth amongst ourselves, bringing our different perspectives to bear. I should say first, my children go to a Quaker school. I clerked for a judge who was a Quaker. I'm not a Quaker myself, and the perspective that I bring is mostly that of a constitutional law professor, which is what I am. So I tend to think about free speech in terms of the First Amendment and legal rules and Supreme Court decisions. But of course, free speech is a value that goes beyond the legal incarnation in the First Amendment and that extends into lots of different areas where many different and complex issues arise. So we've also got two other wonderful people to share their perspectives. And I'm going to just start by asking them to introduce themselves briefly. First we have Jane Calvert, who is the director and chief editor of the John Dickinson Writings Project. Jane, could you say a little bit about yourself?
Yes, hi. Thank you for this opportunity, and I'm excited to be here with my two esteemed colleagues for what promises to be a very interesting discussion. Right. So my name is Jane Calvert. I'm as Kermit said, the director and chief editor of the John Dickinson Writings Project. My work has focused on Quaker constitutional theory. I'm a historian. And I mainly stay in the 17th and 18th centuries. And so my first book was on Quaker constitutional theory and the political thought of John Dickinson. And my work has since evolved to focus mainly on John Dickinson. And I'm working to bring his papers to light, to publish those. And I recently published the first complete and accurate biography of him. And he was, as far as I can tell, the founder, the American founder who was talking about free speech earlier than just about anybody. And so it'll be interesting to get into talking about 18th century understandings of free speech and sort of, how those have evolved, how that understanding has evolved over the course of our history.
Thank you. That's great. And Sean? Sean is the executive director of the Arch Street Meeting House Preservation Trust.
Yeah, pleasure to be joining you for this interesting conversation. And yes, I'm Sean Connolly, the executive director of the Arch Street Meeting House Preservation Trust. Essentially means that I help operate the Arch Street Meeting House as a National Historic Landmark, a historic site, and really excitingly, ahead of the semi-quincentennial of the United States, we're doing our first full exhibit renovation of the property. So about half the building is dedicated as a museum space and half is a historic Quaker worship space. So it's really exciting. We've not been able to redo these exhibits since the bicentennial. So there's a lot of hidden histories and Quaker stories that were really important for the foundation of the country, but also into the 21st century that we've not been able to tell. And as a result of this project, we're able to dig more deeply into those histories and get the general public interested in that as well. So very excited to be joining you and excited for this conversation.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, so Jane, you mentioned that you um, have been working on John Dickinson, and he's one of the earliest founders to be talking about free speech. So I think that's sort of the origins of our country, our Constitution. John Dickinson's a very important early legal figure. Is a great place to start. So could you tell us something about Dickinson's view of free speech, or the 18th century view of free speech, and how that connects to Quakerism, if you see connections there and the principles that we're thinking of here?
Yeah, absolutely. This is actually a huge topic and a great place to begin. I should also say that, like Kermit, I am not a Quaker, and neither was John Dickinson, but both of us are what Quakers call fellow travelers. So people who sort of appreciate Quaker values and principles and practices, but are not actual Quakers in name. So Dickinson was raised as a Quaker. His parents were Quakers. He married into the most prominent Quaker family in Pennsylvania in 1770. His wife was a very devout Quaker. One of his daughters also became a member, and his extended family on his wife's side were devout Quakers. So Dickinson's idea of free speech, and let's also extend that to mean freedom of the press. It's of course very, very closely related. So his ideas of this were really rooted in Quakerism, and this can get very, very complicated very quickly. But basically, within the Quaker meeting, two ideas were very important. Those were the unity of the body, so the unity of the kind of the constitution of the members, and also dissent, productive, peaceful dissent, because dissent that happens within the unity of the meeting is how the meeting moves forward and enacts what it believes to be God's will. So there has to be, and so I should also back up and say that Quakers believed that anybody could be a minister, and that meant rich, poor, male, female, black, white. They could be ministers because they believed in universal salvation, universal that God's light could be in any person, and any person who could receive God's light and who was compelled to speak by God had to come forward and speak, and then that person would be a minister, not ordained by the meeting, but ordained by God. And so the majority then was bound to listen to any dissenting person who came forward and said, God is speaking through me to inform the meeting that we need to go in maybe a slightly different direction. A great example of this is the advent of the Quaker anti-slavery testimony, where initially there were some stirrings of anti-slavery in the late 17th century, but then a Quaker named Benjamin Lay came forward in the early 18th century and made really big commotion about the sinfulness of enslavement and pro-abolition, and he brought this message to the meeting in a very disruptive way. He really provoked members of the meeting, and he got himself promptly disowned. So flash forward a few years, and another man had the same idea about abolition, and his name was John Woolman, and he came forward with a very the same message, but delivered in a very different way, in a very conciliatory way, in a very sort of peaceful way. And he did not destroy the unity of the meeting. Rather, he convinced and persuaded Quaker slave owners that really the Christian thing to do was to free the people they enslaved. And then gradually that got sort of incorporated into the Quakers' discipline, and so it became a part of the meeting to work for the abolition of slavery. Okay, so So this was the context that Dickinson was functioning in, and when he was a very young man, he was trained in the law first in Philadelphia, and then in England at the Middle Temple, the Inns of Court, and when he returned to America and he began his practice in 1757. The first really big case that he worked on was a libel trial. And that libel trial was the Pennsylvania Assembly. So the government of Pennsylvania was going after one of their biggest critics. His name was William Smith, and he became later the provost of what became University of Pennsylvania. And so Smith was a really, really sharp critic of the Assembly, and the Assembly didn't like that. So they went after him on charges of libel for reprinting a criticism of the Quaker Assembly, reprinting it in a German, getting it translated into German, reprinting it in a German language, reprinting it, not printing it for the first time. Now, this is a complicated case, but what basically happened is that it was a sham trial put on by the Pennsylvania Assembly, and Smith's attorney was a man named John Ross, and Dickinson was just his junior colleague who was working on the case with him. But when the Assembly basically bullied Ross into backing down, Smith turned to Dickinson and asked if Dickinson would defend him. And so Dickinson stepped forward and defended this man against the most powerful force in Pennsylvania, the Legislative Assembly, and he spoke truth to power, and he defended this man's rights to liberty of the press and freedom of speech, and Dickinson received himself threats of arrest and imprisonment. And Dickinson made very eloquent arguments for liberty of the press, and arguments that we could really take today, that liberty of the press is the great preserver of all liberties, and that tyranny, even the most pernicious kind, will fly away in the face of liberty of the press. So another thing, and this is something perhaps Kermit would like to say something about as well, but the understanding of freedom of speech and freedom of the press was very different at this time than it became in later American history. There was really no codification for these things, and so there were not the protections for freedom of speech. But we can talk more about that later. I'll stop for now, and I'll say that this happened. So this early defense of liberty of the press and freedom of speech happened in 1758, and so really Americans were not talking about codifying freedom of speech or of the press until really 1787, with actually I would say not even until after that, after the Constitution, after the ratification of it, until we get to the Bill of Rights. So I'll stop there. I've talked a long time and said a lot of things, but I hopefully that sort of gives us a foundation for talking about the role of Quakerism and just seeing where we are with freedom of speech and freedom of the press in this colonial period immediately before the Revolution.
Thank you, Jane. That's really interesting. Actually, that raises several questions in my mind about free speech and the values that we're trying to address today. But before I ask you that question, I wanted to give Sean a chance to say a little bit about his work and how it relates to free speech, and what sort of exhibits and stories you have going on.
Well, as Jane alluded to, Quaker practice is very much grounded in the idea of free speech in worship. You know, anyone at any point can stand and say whatever it is that they want to say, and the worship community is there to listen and respond. Um, and so it's very different from your traditional Christian model of worship, where there is a lot of doctrine and robes and mysticism that's telling you to believe a certain thing. And so when George Fox founded Quakerism, it was very much as part of the Protestant Reformation, in opposition to a lot of the trimmings and the trappings and the dogma and the rules and what you can and can't say in a worship community. So Quakers were foundational in that. And when they came to Pennsylvania, of course, they also set up a system of government that mirrored a lot of the British parliamentary system, but also had a lot of this Quaker influence, because most of the members of the government at the time were Quakers. So it's core to how the Pennsylvania government was set up, just as it was core to how the Quaker faith was founded and has been continue in practice from that time to now. And so the exhibits that we're talking about will explore a great many of those issues. Some will be about Japanese internment in the Second World War, again, nothing to do with the founding of Pennsylvania, but how the American Friends Service Committee and other Quakers really fought to help those interned to get their rights back, to be able to say and be who they are. And then other examples will, of course, be the sort of Quaker government stance in 1750s related to what Franklin was doing. Franklin bringing in a lot of bold ideas about how Pennsylvania government should change and potentially be less Quaker. So we're sort of running the full gamut of exhibits that folks will be able to experience in the future.
Thank you. That sounds really fabulous. Really interesting. It brings up a lot of different topics. One of the things that I often say to people about Quakerism, actually, is if you're looking for a religion that's on the right side of history, the Quakers have a very good track record. I think probably, I say, the best among religions. And I was thinking about that because of what you said about the Japanese American detention, because the Quakers were a notable group there who were protesting that and supporting the detained Japanese Americans. Okay, so I'm going to ask a couple questions now, but I do encourage people who are watching to submit questions through the Q&A box feature. So our first principle or value here was equanimity. And I guess I come to that with sort of a modern perspective. And I think about that equanimity and free speech as having sort of two faces. One is, how do you react to an offensive idea? So do you react with outrage and an attempt to silence people or cancel them? And this connects maybe to cancel culture and things like that. I think equanimity would probably suggest that we try not to do that we try to engage in measured and civil discourse. So it connects to this idea that is in vogue now about civility and productive disagreement. My daughter just applied to college, so I've been paying some attention to the college application process, and apparently productive disagreement is now what they want students to be able to demonstrate. That's like the big personal trait they're looking for on applications. So equanimity has something, I think, to do with how we react to encountering views that we disagree with. And the flip side of that, I think it also has something to do with how we present our own views. So I was very struck by the story that Jane was telling about different abolitionists within the Quaker community, and how one person was strident and divisive and didn't apparently succeed. I don't know this history as well as you do, of course. And then a second person did better with a more conciliatory approach, because on the one hand, that does seem to suggest equanimity, that's a good thing, be calm and civil, and you're going to be more persuasive. On the other hand, I do think that civility is often used as a way of suppressing dissent. So a demand for civility can, in fact, make it more difficult to really express radical views or to advocate for change. And sometimes I think change does require disruption. It's sometimes not possible to get people's attention without sort of breaking the normal order of things, which is what protests often do. So Jane, I was wondering if you have any similar thoughts about equanimity, I guess, or whether the way that I'm trying to articulate this concept in the modern day connects to the history that you're talking about.
Oh boy, do I. So yeah, I'll try not to launch into lecture mode again. So the way I look at this and is sort of on, well, another maybe I'll say another way to couch this is in terms of political dissent and change reform. So there's kind of a continuum in the early modern world. The overriding question of the American Revolution, for example, or of any kind of tense moment in American history, or in this period of Anglo-American history, is what is a people to do if the government oppresses them? And, basically, how do you respond if the government is oppressing your group or you as an individual? And the gamut ran from sort of, I guess, what we would call sort of small c conservative on the one side, which was and this was sort of the Anglican, religious view of the king can do no wrong, the government was ordained by God and it's right, and so the only thing that you can do is to humbly petition the king for redress of grievances. And if the king chose not to respond, that was his prerogative, and you just had to kind of accept whatever he was going to do. On the far other extreme was the Calvinist Puritan kind of Whig theory of revolution that said if the government oppressed you, yes, you petition, but if the petition is ignored, then you escalate that to rioting. And eventually, if the government is still not responsive, you head towards revolution and overthrow of that government. So that's sort of the opposite of equanimity. And then the Quakers had this kind of approach in the middle, which was you maintain that even temperedness and that calm and that peace, but you also protest very vigorously. And they, in doing so, invented the theory and practice of civil disobedience, where you publicly but peacefully break unjust laws with the intent of reforming the system and getting change, building change from the ground up. But this was all in keeping with their sort of theo-political concepts of the meeting, that dissenter has to dissent with love in his or her heart and peacefulness, and with preserving the unity of the polity. And so there was no violence done to people or property. So, Quakers were pacifists. And so, no destruction of human beings or property or God's creations, which included the civil constitution. So preserving that divinely ordained unity. So we can see here that equanimity is really at the heart of Quakerism and Quaker theological political theory. But it's not. But it's interesting because their opponents could, on the one hand, laugh at them and say that this is Locke said this is a ridiculous form of resisting. It's not going to get anywhere. But on the other hand, they were accused of sedition, and the government, there was a law passed that basically said, like, any people meeting together as Quakers did to worship, even if they had no arms and were not doing anything except for meeting, that was considered to be a riot and the potential overthrow of the government by force of arms. By force of arms was a sort of a term of art, even if Quakers were sitting there meeting peacefully with no weapons. So it's kind of in the eye of the beholder. And one person's freedom fighter is another person's revolutionary, and Quakers were accused of sort of the whole gamut of activities, but they always had this central focus of peaceful resistance and trying to bring that message of the need for change and justice and reform in the least disruptive way possible. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Sean, can you give us a perspective on this related to Quaker meetings? Maybe I'm trying to bring in a question from the Q&A because we've got a question that says, in Quaker meetings, were there limits to free speech, such as heresy? So, would a heretical statement during a Quaker meeting be greeted with equanimity, or would it be considered a violation of equanimity?
Oh gosh, I mean that probably depends so much on the exact statement. I'll say that Quakers they're not a monolith. Continue to evolve, and even in the first 20 years, evolved so much where folks like Margaret Fell were in positions of real power and authority, but because we exist in hierarchical structures outside of the Quaker faith became vaguely hierarchical, and so we fell into norms and traditions that exist in every faith tradition. The committee structure was established, which allowed clerks of committees and people in power to say, actually, what you're saying isn't for the best of the meeting. We might need to set up a committee to talk to you about how you are conducting yourself in worship or what you're saying. Or maybe you're simply read out of the meeting. You're no longer welcome as part of this tradition. So yes, I mean, they are one of, to take it back, Kermit, to what you said earlier, they are one of the best religions, probably, but they definitely fall into the same problems that a lot of other faith traditions have, where there are structures. Religion, I guess, to a certain extent, needs structure, and they need some rules, and that means that the people on the fringes are often going to be the ones who are told, you're not allowed to say that in worship. And it also depends on where the meetings are. And so over the course of 350 years, geographically, Quakers, you might be part of a area of Quakers where they're much more liberal. You can say whatever you want. We're going to support you 100%. And then there's going to be more conservative branches of Quakers that are going to say, actually, no, you have to believe this specific dogma. We're in a conservative part of the country, and that's the way it is. So, by no means a monolith, and I would say it's complicated. Worship is complicated, and so people are going to feel strongly if you say something that is outside of the norm.
It is absolutely complicated, and I think you do need rules, because without rules, you've got the prospect of anarchy in general, and then also you've got bad people who will take advantage of the lack of rules to act in ways that are not productive or public interested. So one of the things that rules do is they set up a structure that allows society to work more efficiently and productively. But then the other thing that rules do is they constrain bad people, because you do sort of inevitably have people who are going to engage in antisocial behavior. And so this is a transition to our next topic of accountability. And again, I think I'm going to give you sort of my contemporary First Amendment inspired response to this, and then sort of try to bounce that off the history and turn to you guys for a different perspective on that. So when we talk about accountability, it brings up some very complicated and difficult questions, I think, because if you're talking about whether there should be accountability for speech, some people will say, no, speech is not free if you're being sanctioned for your speech. And then other people will say, no, freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences. And legally, there are different ways of trying to operationalize those competing principles. In the founding era, it seems possible, the history is sort of disputed, and this is one of the questions in First Amendment theory, that there was this idea that freedom of speech actually meant freedom from prior restraint. So the government shouldn't be able to stop you from speaking, but they could actually punish you afterwards, so that that kind of accountability was permitted. Now, of course, that's totally contrary to our First Amendment doctrine. Now, freedom of speech is understood to be freedom from consequences in a certain sense. So the big thing about the First Amendment and the Constitution more generally is it only restrains the government. So if you speak and the government doesn't like what you're saying, they can't put you in jail for it. They can't usually fire you from a government job. So if it's the government that's trying to express its disapproval of what you said, the ways that they can do that are relatively limited. But other people are usually perfectly free to do that. So they can fire you. Sometimes the employer could fire you if they don't like what you've said. If you express political views that your employer finds abhorrent or that they think will alienate customers, they can absolutely fire you for that. And other people, of course, can punish you with social sanctions. They can shun you. And it seems like, to a certain extent, wow, that's a real consequence for speech. And you might wonder, are people going to self-censor because they're afraid that they're going to be canceled? On the other hand, you might say, but look, what the people who are engaging in this cancel culture are doing really is counter speech. You know, they're using their own freedom of speech to oppose what you've said, and they're saying this is the sort of viewpoint that we find unacceptable. So there's a real tension there, I think. And in the First Amendment context, we manage it somewhat by distinguishing so sharply between what the government does and what private individuals do. But that's really a legal construct that doesn't necessarily give us the best balance in terms of free speech values or the free speech environment, if that's what we're considering about. So I was wondering if you have different perspectives on that sort of tension, the balance between accountability and censorship or self-censorship, from people who are afraid of these kinds of social sanctions. Something that you definitely see in the academic context. I teach at Penn Law, and here as well as at other schools, I think there's definitely self-censorship going on in the classroom. Some students are afraid to speak out. There's some views that are very unpopular, or people just don't want to cause tension. So I was wondering if you could give me some different perspectives on this delicate balancing act. And I'll start with you, Sean.
Well, I guess I'll make, because it's so important to the Quaker faith, liberty of conscience, which, essentially you should be able to think and to a certain extent say whatever you want in the Quaker world. And, that is relatively true, I would say, within Quaker circles. I feel like if you were to paint a picture of all of the people who have gotten thrown out of meeting over the course of 350 years, some would have been thrown out for really grounded reasons. There's a discipline that says you can't do this, and you did that thing. And then I bet there's a ton of people, maybe 50% of the people, that were thrown out because the clerk in charge of the meeting didn't like what you said. And so that is not really about the Quaker faith itself. That's about a person in power who can wield that power to remove someone from a faith. And so I think that's an accountability crisis. And I'm sure that is something that's replicable across America and state government and nonprofits and business. It's the people in power who wield that power in a bad way to censor. That's a big issue, certainly for Quakers, and certainly for all Americans, I would say.
Right, and that's even another dimension, is holding the government responsible, or holding anyone who sanctions you accountable for their use of that power. Jane, what sort of perspective can you give us on this?
Yeah, so I'm torn in my answer between talking about 18th century issues and contemporary issues. So maybe I'll say a little bit of both. Really glad. Yeah, I'm really glad that Sean mentioned liberty of conscience, because that's really at the core of the Quaker understanding of free speech and the First Amendment. So just quickly on Dickinson, one of his biggest concerns throughout at least the first half of his career was protecting liberty of conscience in Pennsylvania. He protected it against Benjamin Franklin and Joseph Galloway's kind of crazy ideas to abolish the 1701 Charter of Privileges that had the religious liberty clause in it. He was arguably the thing that concerned him most about breaking from Britain, declaring independence, was that Quakers would lose that protection of liberty of conscience because their constitution would go away. So in preparation for that, he wrote his draft of the Articles of Confederation, America's first draft constitution in 1776, that replicated that religious liberty clause that was in the Pennsylvania Constitution. And yet he adapted it very slightly. He changed the wording very slightly to make it, to use gender inclusive language to include not just women's, protections for women's religious liberty, but their practice of speech, which of course for Quakers meant preaching. And so in that clause, then he was protecting women's freedom of public speech, which is, to my mind, the most revolutionary moment of the revolution. Of course, Americans at that time completely rejected liberty of conscience, freedom of speech. They wanted no part of that in 1776, at least not codifying it. And then they proceeded to violate those things by rounding up and imprisoning Quakers for 9 months. But then eventually Americans kind of came back to that, and we got the First Amendment that protects religious liberty and freedom of speech together. So liberty of conscience and liberty of speech have always been very closely tied together. Okay, so that's my 18th century remark. My contemporary remark goes to Kermit's ideas about or his mention of the higher education, the university, and so that is a really tricky situation. And I guess in a nutshell, how I have seen it is, and this is where we get into some really sticky politics. So maybe this is where it gets really fun. Okay, so the right has charged the left with sort of domineering in colleges and universities and censoring speech from with left-wing bias, and in other words, silencing, excluding conservatives from the academy and silencing their speech. And although there's not a lot I agree with on the right, I did personally see this firsthand, where students felt silenced, conservative students felt silenced in class, and faculty, if faculty members, if they were even hired with conservative viewpoints, faculty members who held maybe not even conservative viewpoints, but maybe viewpoints that just did not coincide with the far left in faculty meetings or whatever, those views would be at best quelled and silenced, and at worst sort of driven out and punished. And so that's a very real kind of censorship that's going on in higher education. But the right wing response to it that we're now seeing from the current administration is to sort of blow up the whole system. So rather than redefining DEI to diversity, equity, and inclusion to bring in conservative voices, they're just wanting to sort of blow it all up and destroy the whole system. And so it seems to me the realistic and productive thing to do is to make space for these dissenting views, as long as the dissenting views are expressed without threatening the sort of physical well-being of other, other people. The purpose of the university is to bring in different ideas, let those ideas compete, and that will sometimes make people very uncomfortable, which is precisely the point. But the sort of truth of the matter gets worked out in the debates, in the deliberation, and then we come to a better, fuller understanding of kind of where we're headed as a society. None of that can happen if one side or the other, is if people are censoring each other. At the same time, if we're talking about accountability, individuals need to make sure that they are, again, in sort of the Quaker spirit, delivering the message in ways that are not not to make assaults on people's their persons, and or their their fundamental values. The message has to be delivered in a way that is so it can be heard. So anyway, I'll stop there. That's sort of a hot and dirty take on contemporary issues in the academy.
I think that's fascinating. I agree with a lot of what you said, actually, as someone who's also a participant and observer in a lot of these academic questions. And I think actually this sort of provides a nice transition to the last idea, this idea of reciprocal liberty. Because, again, I'm going to give you my sort of modern legal perspective on this. Even going to mention a Supreme Court case now. The way that I think about the idea of reciprocal liberty is we understand that I have my rights and you have your rights, but we're supposed to be able to exercise our rights, but we also understand that sometimes my exercise of my rights can interfere with yours. And so I have some kind of obligation not to do that so that we can both enjoy meaningful liberty. And one aspect of that, I think, is something that you see in the academic environment where you have these arguments about microaggressions and speech as violence, where the idea is some people's expressions of their views are actually an infringement on my rights. And that's, a claim that we should take seriously. I think some people have lived experiences that make them experience the articulation of certain viewpoints in ways that it's hard for us to understand if we don't have that background. And so, maybe in some contexts, exercising freedom of speech does sort of feel like a violation of other people's rights. On the other hand, the remedy that is put forward for that is to silence those people and put some views or some kinds of expression off limits, which also seems to violate the principle of reciprocal liberty. And then you see, reactions to controversial speakers sometimes where the attempt is to disrupt the event or to shout down the speaker and make it impossible for other people to hear them. And that, I think is probably undesirable from a free speech perspective, because it's not the case that more speech is always better if some speech prevents people from hearing other speech. So that's sort of my embrace of the right-wing position, kind of, in the campus context, where I think, you should let people speak and you should engage in counter speech, but you shouldn't try to silence or suppress them or make it impossible for other people to hear what they're saying. But then, interestingly enough, you've got another context where this principle is at play, where the right-wing position seems to be sort of the opposite. So if you're talking not about a campus speaker getting shouted down by the audience, but if you're talking about a political campaign where the concern is that one side or one candidate with a lot of money can effectively drown out people who have less money, or corporations can effectively drown out the voices of individuals. There, interestingly, the Supreme Court, and it's the conservative position, the Supreme Court has said, no, more speech is always better from a First Amendment perspective, and we're not going to allow the government to try to limit the speech of some people in order to equalize the playing field, in order to make it possible for all sides to get heard. Which I think is really interesting, because I think that's pretty clearly wrong from the perspective of democracy or democratic deliberation. It's not good just to get a fire hose of attack ads from whoever has the most money. I think in the First Amendment context, it's maybe somewhat justifiable from a slightly different perspective, which is that we just don't trust the government to put limits on speech. I think it's a hard question. Maybe there are some kinds of campaign finance reform that we should understand as democracy protecting and enhancing the speech environment. But I guess I would just like to hear sort of what your reactions to this idea of reciprocal liberty from your own perspectives or sort of related to anything that I've said are. And I'm going to go and start with Jane first this time again.
Well, as usual, you brought up a lot of really fascinating ideas. I guess for me, maybe the kernel of it is that when we're living in this political community and we're responsible for self-government, and I mean that on an individual level, but also on a larger level. I think, and this goes back to the very first comment I made, that the individual has to approach the community with a message in a way that it can be heard. And how does one do that? And I think it has to sort of, there has to be some kind of inner something within oneself that that regulates what you say. And I think it has to be like, there has to be like something like empathy, or some kind of civility, but I don't mean that in the kind of that sort of civility, the politeness that sort of silences people, but more of a kind of an empathy that tries to, and I guess this would be the kind of the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And Quakers, Quakers cited, and I think it's from Matthew, Quakers cited this principle over and over and over again, in how we should deal with one another and how they wanted to deal with one another. That you have to kind of put yourself in the other person's place and try to understand where they're coming from, so that you're not going to, come out and say things that are just, like, violence, speech violence or assaults. Because, the whole sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That's not true. And so there has to be some kind of inner regulating mechanism, I think, and the Quaker principle is, the golden rule is a good one. Yeah, like campaign finance. I mean, like, yeah, when one group, because of the money they have like a massive megaphone that they use to blast everybody out of the picture, that's not conducive to democracy. So clearly something needs to be done about that, but I'm certainly not an expert in that area.
Sean.
I'm trying to stay in my lane here. Quaker practice, Quaker history. And I think what I will say is that the spirit that moves you to speak, it is supposed to be deliberate. It's not supposed to, obviously it's not supposed to be mean-spirited, but if someone says something in worship, and I think this is applicable to to politics or civil discussion, but you're supposed to sit with what that person says and not immediately react. You're supposed to wait in the Quaker world until the spirit moves you to say something, and hopefully that gives you time to really reflect and have a nuanced, well thought out, not mean or aggressive answer, or question. And so that's really what I'll say in the Quaker context. It's sitting and waiting until you feel ready to respond in a civil way. And Quakers have succeeded in that, and they've also really failed at that sometimes. but that I think is the intent, which is you wait for that inner light to move you to speak with some deliberation.
That makes sense, and I see that as an aspect of protecting other people's speech. I do see that as reciprocal liberty. So it's 11:50 now. I think it's probably time to sort of turn to some of the questions that we've been getting. We've only got a few, so I encourage anyone to submit more. But maybe to start with, Sean, and then just building off of what you were just talking about, there are a couple questions about consensus. So there's a request to define the meaning and limits of consensus, and how that works to produce agreement.
Oh, it's hard. It's hard. I think in theory, if there isn't consensus, meaning if someone specifically stands up and says, I dissent, I disagree with this, the meeting, the worship community won't move on it. There's nothing in the world that could push the organization forward if someone actually dissents. So essentially that means universal consensus. In reality, what that means is some person might, which makes governance challenging for Quakers. In reality, what most often happens is some people will say, I disagree with that in as strongest a possible stance possible, but I don't dissent. So the majority of the meeting, the consensus, if you will move forward whatever they're talking about, whatever big issue, enslavement, obviously in the context of the 17th and 18th centuries, will move forward without anyone derailing the conversation. But I mean, yeah, consensus, it is complicated if someone truly dissents and minutes their dissent. And that can be a real challenge for moving forward anything within the Quaker sphere.
Oh, Jane, do you want to say something?
Yeah, if I could, I would just like to add to that wonderful description that Sean just gave, to say that that is exactly, people wonder why, why John Dickinson did not want independence, and what he did, and then why he actually, after he really spoke out against independence for a decade, and then immediately before the vote, why then he joined, led his military unit to the front and actually, served in the armed forces to defeat the British. And so what he did was exactly what Sean described, which is that he dissented, but then when it came time for the Congress to decide which way to go, after he had voiced his objections, he then knew that the meeting, as it were, the Congress, was going to go in a different direction. So he then removed his objection. He stepped aside. That's what Quakers call it. He stepped aside and allowed the vote to proceed, ideally unanimously. And then, and this is also good Quaker practice, after the group goes you've removed your objection and the group goes in the direction that you didn't want to go, because you have removed your objection, you are then bound to support the group in its goals. And so it's sort of the epitome of grace. Voicing your opinion, the group says we don't agree, and then but you want to preserve that unity, and so you support them going forward. It's really sort of also not just the epitome of grace, but the epitome of democratic deliberation and voting. That's why we accept the results of elections, and we, the losers concede, and then they support, or in theory at least should support, the next administration. That's what our system is based on. So yeah, consensus and dissent within that, and coming back together after disagreement. It's it's what America has functioned on. It hasn't always worked. It's broken down at significant moments, but it's and we're in a place now where we're not sure what's going to happen. But that's what has allowed us to survive pretty well for almost 250 years.
Yeah, consensus and grace and accepting being outvoted and moving forward together. I think those are all really important values. I would say our democratic system does depend on one, the idea that the losers concede, and then they try to work with the winners to advance the public interest. But also that the winners understand themselves as leaders of the whole country and not just leaders of the winning coalition. And I think, we've maybe falling short in both respects there. We're starting to run out of time, but there is one thing that I wanted to mention or bring up and maybe ask your views on, Jane, because it came to mind. So the need for universal consensus and unanimity depends a lot. I mean, if you're going to have a system that requires that, it depends a lot on people's willingness to set aside their objections. And what this made me think of course, because I'm a constitutional law professor, was the Articles of Confederation, which required unanimous consent for an amendment. And John Dickinson, I believe, is one of the primary drafters of the Articles. Is that right?
Well, he was the drafter, really the sole draftsman of the first version that was produced in June 1776. But that version was more or less eviscerated. All of his main provisions, including the liberty of conscience provision, those were all excised. And the version that was ratified in 1781, it bore almost no resemblance to his version. So, which is why he was so intent. One of the reasons he was so intent on having it, reformed and then replaced in the federal convention.
Ah, okay. Because I was going to say, that the Articles of Confederation didn't work, and in part they didn't
Mhm.
work because of this unanimity requirement, which made it so
Yeah,
difficult to make necessary changes.
yeah.
And that's also the reason, the unanimity requirement, why the Constitution looks sort of like a revolution, because it violates the procedures for change that are set out in the Articles. The Articles say amendments require unanimous consent. The Constitution says this will become effective upon the ratification of 9 states. So it's interesting in light of the conversation that we've been having, I think, that the very founding of America, you don't have this consensus. You don't have sort of civility in terms of observing the rules that were set out. You've got this really sort of revolutionary energy that gives us the second attempt, I guess, at American self-governance, but the first attempt really to make a nation rather than a confederacy, because the Articles of Confederation create this confederation. The states are still basically independent sovereigns. Well, we are running out of time, but I wanted to give you both maybe one chance to ask or to answer a last question, which is, in general, do you think that we have lived up to the First Amendment ideals of the founders? And if not, what do you think we should focus on more? Sean, maybe you'd like to start with that.
Oh gosh. Well, since there were no Quaker founders, I can say I don't know. I don't rightly know if we've lived up to it. I would say in the 21st century context, probably not. I feel like it's just so radically different from how William Penn's Charter of Privileges imagined it would be. And that's not a founder of country, but founder of Pennsylvania. Yeah, I would say it's so different that no, we haven't. And I'll keep my answer brief.
Well, I mean, that's one of the things that I always say about originalism is it's just such a different world. It's just very hard to figure out what it would even mean to try to be faithful to the understandings. Jane, last words.
Well, so Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned originalism because that's kind of what this question gets to. And I would also say, I mean, though Dickinson was not a Quaker in name, he was certainly a Quaker founder, in the sense that he was bringing, Quaker principles to the discussion. I mean, so, of course, the answer is both yes and no. Um, I think that the no is both a good thing and a bad thing. It's good that we didn't live up to the founders' ideals, because then, we might still have gross, like really gross inequality, maybe slavery. Women wouldn't have any recognized rights. So, maybe it's a good thing that we have not lived up to their principles. But in other ways, I think more, when we're talking about sort of processes and structures, I think we have done relatively well, until recently, when I think that, you know, maybe the mark, of the most severe departure was with the immunity decision, the Supreme Court, saying that there was presidential immunity for any acts, done in office and could not be, held criminally responsible. That's a huge departure from what the framers, believed, and we are sort of swiftly breaking sort of other, not just norms, but constitutional structures, to the question has been, oh, are we in a constitutional crisis? Well, I defer to my friend and colleague Jack Rakove on this, who said we're not in constitutional crisis, we're in constitutional failure. And so we've departed drastically in some ways. In a way, as the Quakers in general, Dickinson kind of comes out looking sort of the best in this. A lot of the ideas that he wanted, abolition, women's rights. Well, we've also failed at one of his main goals of like prison reform. But, he had some ideas that we only just started to recognize in the 20th century. But now it seems like we're kind of reverting to maybe even a pre-Glorious Revolution, state of constitutional affairs, which, that's a whole other, probably a whole other webinar to talk about that kind of regression to, to Stuart England. But maybe we can have that discussion if we want. Yeah, I mean, yes and no. We've done some great things, and we're also in some serious trouble. So.
All right. Thank you very much. So yes, looking forward, it's complicated. I think as Americans, we all have a responsibility to try to work together and make the best that we can of the situation. Thank you very much, Jane Calvert, Sean Connolly, everyone watching. Thank you for being here with us. I've enjoyed this.
Thank you very much.
All right. Goodbye.